Hello, welcome to the channel. Subscribe, leave a like, and don't forget to write a comment. Enjoy watching.
I had just poured myself a cup of coffee, one of those rare, quiet Sunday mornings when the world felt still and manageable, like I could finally catch up on the laundry, organize the garage, and maybe even spend 10 minutes pretending I wasn't the only adult in my entire damn family. When my phone buzzed with Zach's name lighting up the screen, I should have ignored it. I should have let it go to voicemail like I had all week. After the last time he called at midnight, slurring his words and asking if I could float him $100, just till Tuesday. But I picked up. I always did. Maybe out of habit, maybe out of guilt. Maybe just because he was my baby brother. And even at 27, I hadn't managed to shake that sense of obligation that had been hammered into me since I was old enough to be left alone with him, while Mom picked up extra shifts at the diner. His voice came fast and nervous. Not drunk this time, but definitely not sober in the way I'd expect someone to be when they're calling with a real emergency. Hey, Lena, listen, don't freak out, but there's been a little accident. And just like that, the coffee didn't taste right anymore. My stomach dropped into the linoleum. The next 10 minutes were a blur of shallow explanations, loud background noises, and Zach doing that thing where he laughs when he's nervous, like he can charm the disaster away if he just talks fast enough. He said something about the brakes not working, like that wasn't my car's first month off the lot. Then muttered about wet roads and something about a deer before finally admitting he'd been going too fast, missed a turn, and plowed into a retaining wall not far from the edge of town. You what? I asked, barely above a whisper, trying to keep my voice even while my hand went white-knuckled around the mug. You totaled it. There was a pause. He probably heard the shift in my voice. Then he let out this stupid little chuckle and said, "Come on, Lena, don't be dramatic. You can afford another one." I don't even remember hanging up. All I remember is staring at the spot on the wall just above the stove, where the plaster cracked years ago, and I never fixed it because every spare dime went into that car. Not because I needed a shiny new toy, but because it was the first real thing I'd bought for myself since Dad died. It was reliable, safe, fully insured, a reward for working 60-hour weeks and taking care of everyone else first. It wasn't just a car, it was freedom. And in under 5 minutes, my brother had crushed it, literally, and acted like I was the one being unreasonable. I drove out to the tow yard because, of course, he didn't stay to deal with the paperwork or talk to the police. That part was left for me, as usual. And when I saw the wreck, twisted and bent like a crushed soda can, it took everything I had not to start screaming right there in front of the poor guy at the front desk. The worst part, Zach wasn't even sorry. He texted me later that night. No call, no apology. Just a text that said, "Glad you're not mad. Love you, sis." As if that covered it. As if love you was a blank check he could keep cashing for the rest of his life. And Mom? Well, when I called her, half out of shock, half hoping she might be the one person who'd finally say, "Zach needs to take responsibility," she sighed like I was making her late for bingo and said, "Well, sweetie, he didn't mean to. He's just been so stressed lately. Maybe this'll be a wake-up call." A wake-up call. I think that was the moment something broke in me, not all at once, but like a thread finally snapping after being pulled too tight for too long. Because it wasn't just about the car. It wasn't even about the money. It was the years, the decades, the endless sacrifices. I had been the one to stay up with Dad when the chemo got so bad he couldn't sleep. I was the one who filled out college applications while Zach snuck out with a fake ID. I was the one who bought Mom her first washer after the old one died and never asked to be paid back. And I was the one who saved and saved and saved until I could finally have something of my own. Just for me, and now that was gone too. And nobody seemed to care. So the next day I printed out the invoice from the insurance adjuster, the one with the full damage report and cost of replacement. And I drove to Mom's house like I was going to Sunday dinner. I brought pie. I smiled. I let her talk about her TV shows and the neighbors, and how proud she was that Zach had finally applied for something serious. I waited until the coffee was poured and the TV was on mute, and then I slipped the paper across the table with a small smile. "What's this?" she asked, adjusting her glasses, eyes scanning the page. I didn't answer, I just watched. It took her a second. Her brow furrowed, and she turned the page over like maybe she missed something. Then she looked again, this time slower, reading line by line until she reached the line that said, "Liable party, Zachary Reynolds." Her face dropped. She looked up, eyes wide. "Lena, what is this?" I leaned back, folded my hands in my lap, and said, "It's the invoice. I figured since you think I can afford another one, and he's been so stressed lately, I'd let you two handle it." The silence that followed was the kind that didn't just fill the room. It pressed on your chest, like a hand holding you down. I let it stretch. I wanted it to sting. I wanted her to feel, for once, just a sliver of what it was like to be me in this family. And I wasn't even close to finished. People like to believe that family means fairness, that blood somehow guarantees loyalty or gratitude, or at the very least a baseline level of decency. But if you've ever been the responsible one in a house full of chaos, if you've ever been the stand-in parent while your mother buried herself in denial and your brother coasted through life like nothing he did ever had consequences, then you know that's a lie dressed up in Hallmark wrapping. And by the time I was 13, I had already understood that in our house, fairness was a fantasy reserved for someone else's daughter. Zach was born when I was 11, and from the second he showed up, everything changed. Not gradually, not subtly, but completely and without discussion. It was like the second he cried in that hospital room, Mom forgot she had a daughter at all, and while she was busy building her whole world around her new baby boy, I was quietly handed the invisible clipboard labeled Responsibilities and told, without words, that I was now the assistant manager of our dysfunctional little household. Dad was still around back then, still trying to keep the roof over our heads with construction jobs and night shifts, but he was tired, so tired. And Mom said it was easier if I just helped out more because I was the mature one. Like being mature was some kind of prize, not a sentence handed down without trial. It started small, keeping Zach occupied so Mom could nap, helping with bottles, folding the laundry she never got to. But by the time I hit high school, I was basically running the house after school while she worked double shifts at the diner. And even then, even at 15, I knew she looked at me not as a daughter, but as some kind of second-tier adult she didn't have to pay. Meanwhile, Zach was already getting away with things kids 5 years older would have been grounded for. He broke the neighbor's window with a baseball, and Mom baked cookies for the poor woman as if sugar could replace glass. He forgot to turn in his homework, and Mom blamed the teachers for not engaging him. He got suspended for vaping behind the gym, and she called it a cry for help instead of what it was, disrespect and defiance dressed in adolescent arrogance. And through it all, I kept my mouth shut because every time I tried to point out how unbalanced things were, Mom would get this tired look on her face, like I was being ungrateful, like I was the one creating problems by refusing to pretend everything was fine. She'd say, "You know how Zach is," as though that explained everything, and maybe it did, for her, because she never had to deal with the teachers calling home or the bills piling up, or the fact that our house always felt one step away from collapsing under the weight of her blind loyalty and his recklessness. That was my job. That was my role. Even when Dad got sick, when the cancer started eating him alive from the inside out, and the man who had once carried beams on his shoulders like they were feathers could barely stand long enough to make it to the bathroom, even then, it was me sitting by the bed with a washcloth, while Mom distracted herself with game shows, and Zach snuck out the back door to meet friends. And after Dad died, when the grief came down like a second roof caving in, she didn't lean on Zach. Didn't expect him to pick up a damn thing. She leaned on me. She said it was because I was strong, because I held it together, but I knew the truth. She leaned on me because I was convenient, because I wouldn't complain, because I'd been raised to believe that love meant sacrifice and silence and stepping aside when other people needed more. Zach didn't grow up. He coasted. Through high school, through community college, 3 semesters, no degree, and a long trail of dropped classes. Through jobs he never kept longer than 6 months. Through relationships that always ended the same way. women tired of cleaning up after someone who refused to take care of himself. And every time, every single time, Mom was there to say, "He's trying." She said it so much it became his motto. "I'm trying, Lena." That's what he said when he asked for money, when he showed up at my apartment at 2 a.m. because he lost his keys, when he left our garage door open and my bike got stolen. I'm trying. And I wanted to scream. Trying is not the same as doing, but what would be the point? No one was listening. By the time I was 30, I had a stable job, a modest apartment, no husband, and no kids. Not because I didn't want a family, but because I knew damn well I was already raising one. And the idea of adding more chaos to my already full plate sounded like the fastest way to lose whatever sanity I had left. Zach, on the other hand, was still living with Mom on and off, still working gigs, still treating the world like it owed him something just for existing. And Mom never questioned it. She coddled him, babied him, shielded him from the consequences that should have shaped him into a man. And when I said anything about it, anything at all, she looked at me like I was attacking her. "Why are you so bitter, Lena?" she'd say, like my frustration was some character flaw I needed to fix. The car was just the last straw. Not the first offense, not even the worst. But it was the clearest, most physical manifestation of a lifetime of being treated like the backup plan. I had paid for every part of that vehicle, down payment, monthly notes, insurance, the whole damn thing, because I wanted something reliable, something mine, something that couldn't be twisted or stolen or explained away by somebody else's bad decisions. And Zach took it, wrecked it, and then laughed. He actually laughed. "You can afford another one." He didn't even realize what he was admitting, that he saw me not as a person with needs and boundaries and limits, but as a resource, like a vending machine he could shake until something fell out. And the worst part wasn't his arrogance. It was that Mom agreed with him. Maybe not out loud, but in the silence that followed when I tried to talk to her, in the way she avoided eye contact, in the way she always had an excuse for him, but never a moment of sympathy for me. So I started thinking, not just about the car, about everything, about the late nights and early mornings, about the missed vacations and canceled plans, about the times I said no and was made to feel guilty, and the times I said yes and was still made to feel like it wasn't enough. I started writing things down, dates, receipts, amounts. I started collecting, because if they wanted to treat me like a bank, fine. I'd show them what it looked like when the bank finally closed. And that was just the beginning. There's something uniquely exhausting about pretending everything is fine when every part of your body wants to scream, when your chest tightens with the weight of unspoken truths and your hands ache with the urge to throw something, anything, just to make someone notice that beneath the calm surface, there's a fire that's been burning for years. That was me for the next few weeks after the crash, after the invoice, after Mom's face collapsed in on itself when she read the name at the bottom of that page, and realized, maybe for the first time, that I wasn't going to quietly eat another loss and nod politely while they trampled the last bit of self-respect I had left. But I didn't scream, I didn't cry, I didn't curse at either of them or throw dishes or demand apologies that I knew would never come. I smiled, I asked how they were, I answered texts with exclamation points and "no worries," and "I understand," even when I didn't. I played the part I'd been cast in since childhood, the dependable, reasonable older sister, because I had learned, through years of disappointment, that direct confrontation never worked in my family. People like my mother and my brother didn't respond to logic or emotional honesty. They recoiled from it like it was poison, and then found a way to make you feel like the villain for daring to disrupt their reality. So I chose a different path, not just quieter, but smarter. I told Zach that I forgave him. I said it over coffee, looking him straight in the eyes as he scratched at a spot on his wrist and shifted uncomfortably in the chair like a kid waiting to be grounded. He didn't expect it. I could see the relief wash over him, smug and satisfied, like I'd just reset the game and cleared his debt. He smiled that same crooked smile he used when we were kids, and he'd broken something of mine and gotten away with it. And I smiled back, just as warmly, just as falsely, because I needed him to believe I'd let it go. Over the next week, I started asking him small, innocent questions, the kind that didn't raise alarms. I asked about the job he'd just landed, something in delivery or logistics, vague enough that even he probably didn't know what it entailed. I offered to help him with the onboarding paperwork, casually mentioning that I'd had to deal with similar forms when I got hired at the firm. I asked if he'd ever figured out that old mess with his unpaid parking tickets, and he laughed it off, saying they'd fallen off the system or something, like legal obligations were just optional suggestions. And I listened. I took notes. I made copies. Because if he wanted to live like nothing mattered, then fine. I'd show him what it looked like when the world suddenly did. Zach had never paid insurance on the car, never even contributed to gas or maintenance, but the day he borrowed it, he was listed as an additional driver because Mom had insisted months earlier that I help him build some credit by letting him co-sign something. I had refused back then, but I did let her talk me into putting his name on the policy as a courtesy, just to prove he was trying to be responsible. At the time, I figured it was harmless. Now, it was the key. I called the insurance company, walked them through the incident, and requested that all future correspondence regarding liability be addressed to the co-listed driver, Zachary Reynolds, whose reckless behavior had led to the total loss. I didn't lie. I didn't forge a thing. I simply made sure that the truth had the proper paperwork behind it. I requested a copy of the formal claim, printed it, highlighted the parts that mattered, and slipped it into a folder I labeled with his name. And while I waited for the pieces to start falling into place, I did what a good sister would do. I bought him lunch. I helped him update his resume. I laughed at his jokes and gave him rides. I showed up to Mom's house for dinner, brought dessert, and asked about her latest back pain like nothing had changed. I was polite, predictable, peaceful, and I made sure that both of them saw me that way. Stable, boring Lena, always the one with a plan, always willing to put the family first. Because that's the kind of person they never see coming. Then, on a Wednesday afternoon that felt like any other, while I was at work reviewing budget proposals, my phone buzzed with a text from Zach. "You get something in the mail from the insurance company, Peg?" It read. I didn't answer. I let it sit. 2 hours later, another one came through. "They're saying I'm on the hook for the damages. WTF? Can you call them and straighten this out?" I waited until after 5. Then I called Mom. She answered on the first ring, probably thinking I was calling to check on her blood pressure or bring her something from the pharmacy. Her voice was light, a little too cheerful. I asked her if Zach had been by recently, and when she said yes, I asked her to hand the phone to him. He got on, grumbling and defensive before I even said a word, already assuming I was going to bail him out like always. "They're saying I owe for the car," he snapped. "They've got me listed as responsible. That's gotta be a mistake." I didn't raise my voice. I didn't argue. I just said, "Check the name on the claim, Zach. You drove the car. You wrecked it. It's in writing. There's no mistake." There was silence on the other end, a long stretch of dead air, as his mind tried to untangle the sudden web of reality closing in on him. He tried to stammer something, but I cut him off. "You said I could afford another one. Turns out, you can't afford this one either." I could hear Mom in the background asking what was going on, her voice rising with concern, and Zach trying to whisper shout without really understanding how volume worked. Then Mom grabbed the phone, her voice tight, like she already knew she was going to hate whatever I was about to say. "What did you do?" she asked. Not accusatory, not yet, but on the edge. I told her I did exactly what she'd asked for all these years. I supported Zach. I gave him a chance. I let him be an adult. And now he'd get the adult consequences that came with it. There was another silence, heavier this time, thick with something like betrayal, but not mine, hers. As though she couldn't believe I'd broken the script. But I wasn't done, not by a long shot. This wasn't revenge. This was a rebalancing. And all they'd seen so far was the first step. There's a particular kind of silence that follows the first major crack. in a family's long-held illusion of unity, and it isn't peaceful or reflective or anything remotely poetic. It's loaded, sharp-edged, like glass that hasn't finished falling to the ground, suspended in that last breathless moment before it shatters completely. That's the silence that filled the space between me and my mother in the days that followed Zach's phone call, and in the rare moments she did speak to me, through clipped texts or reluctant voicemails. It was as if every word had to be filtered through decades of unspoken resentment she didn't even know she carried. Like now that I had finally chosen myself over the family, I was no longer one of them. But I had spent too many years being the glue that held everything together, even when I was crumbling inside. And I wasn't going to be guilt-tripped back into that role just because they were uncomfortable facing the reality I'd served them on a silver platter. When she finally showed up at my apartment, unannounced of course, because in her mind I was still supposed to be available at any hour for any crisis she deemed important enough to involve me, I wasn't surprised. But I also wasn't the daughter she remembered. She stood on my doorstep with the same exasperated look she used to wear when I dared to question her judgment as a teenager. And even though her voice was calm at first, it had that brittle undertone that always showed up when she was fighting the urge to say something cruel. I let her in, offered her tea I knew she wouldn't drink, and waited. "I just don't understand what you're trying to prove, Lena," she said finally, placing her purse on the kitchen counter like she was planning to stay longer than she was welcome. "This isn't like you." And there it was again, that line, that sharp little dismissal that translated to, "I don't like this version of you because it doesn't serve me." And instead of reacting, instead of taking the bait, I walked into my office, pulled out a thick manila folder, and dropped it on the table between us with a dull, decisive thud. Inside were years of receipts, bank transfers, loan documents, repair invoices, and every unpaid bill I'd quietly covered without a word, everything I had absorbed in silence while Zach stumbled through adulthood with all the grace of a wrecking ball, and Mom continued to shield him like he was some fragile relic, instead of a grown man who had never once taken responsibility for anything. She opened the folder and started leafing through the pages, her expression slowly twisting from confused to defensive, then to something resembling shame. But she didn't cry, she didn't apologize. She just kept shaking her head, muttering to herself, as though the existence of proof somehow made me the villain. "You didn't have to keep track," she whispered, almost to herself, and I almost laughed. Because of course I didn't have to. Not if I wanted to keep being their doormat. Not if I wanted to keep swallowing my own needs for the sake of a family that never once stopped to ask what I was giving up. "I know I didn't," I said, my voice steady, but ice cold. "But I did, because someone had to remember all the things you were so quick to forget." She tried to pivot then, like she always did, from confrontation to guilt, the emotional sleight of hand she'd mastered over the years, telling me about how hard it was after Dad died, how much she had struggled, how she did the best she could. And maybe that was true. Maybe she really did think that shielding Zach from the world was the best way to protect him. And maybe she really believed that leaning on me wasn't the same as using me. But that didn't make it right. That didn't undo the damage. "Do you even hear yourself?" I asked, no longer trying to soften the edges of my frustration. "You're standing in my kitchen, asking me why I finally set a boundary, and your answer to everything is, well, it was hard." Newsflash, Mom, it was hard for me too, but I did it anyway. I held everything together while you both treated me like a safety net. And the second I stopped catching your falls, I'm suddenly the problem. She stood up then, grabbing her purse with more force than necessary, her lips pressed into a tight, judgmental line. "You've changed," she said, like it was an accusation, and I nodded. "Yes," I replied, meeting her gaze with an unflinching calm that was as new to me as it was to her. "I've stopped bleeding for people who act like it's my work to heal them." After she left, the apartment felt both lighter and lonelier, like I'd exorcised a ghost that had been haunting the corners of every room. But there was no sense of triumph, no surge of empowerment, Just a quiet sort of grief for the years I'd lost, for the relationship we could have had, for the realization that sometimes people don't want to grow. They just want you to stay small enough to make them feel comfortable. Meanwhile, Zach was unraveling in real time. The letters from the insurance company started piling up, each one more urgent than the last, and his once smug texts had morphed into frantic voicemails filled with half-hearted apologies and vague threats, as if I might be scared enough to reverse course. I ignored them, all of them, because I had learned that answering chaos with compassion only fed it, and I was done being its caretaker. Eventually, he stopped calling me and started calling mutual friends, trying to rally support, spinning stories that painted me as cold, vindictive, obsessed with money. But people who had known me for years didn't buy it. They had seen the patterns, they had witnessed the toll, and while no one said it to my face, I knew they understood, maybe for the first time, why I had finally snapped. I heard through the grapevine that Zach's credit took a nosedive, that he lost the job before the 90-day mark because they ran a background check and flagged the financial instability. He tried to move back in with Mom, but even she, faced with the stark reality of mounting legal threats and letters she couldn't ignore, told him no, for now at least. And I knew that wouldn't last. I knew she'd cave eventually, but that wasn't my concern anymore. What mattered was that, for the first time in my life, I had forced both of them to look at the mess they'd made, and to sit in it without expecting me to sweep it all under the rug. I hadn't screamed or slammed doors, I hadn't played dirty, I had simply said no. And when that wasn't enough, I let the truth, written in black and white, line by line, do the screaming for me. I slept better that week than I had in years, not because everything was fixed, but because I wasn't holding it all together by myself anymore. They were finally feeling the weight I had carried for decades, and somehow that felt like the closest thing to justice I was ever going to get. But part of me knew this wasn't over, because people like Zach don't go quietly, and mothers like mine don't change overnight. The damage was done, but the fallout was just beginning. Time has a strange way of softening even the sharpest edges when you allow enough of it to pass, and yet, despite the weeks that slowly unraveled into months, despite the phone calls that grew fewer and further between, and the awkward silences that replaced the once familiar rhythms of our dysfunctional family life, there remained a certain tension that lingered beneath everything like a low electrical hum, an unspoken acknowledgement that something fundamental had shifted, that some line had been crossed, not loudly or violently, but in a way that could never be fully undone. And even though no one said it out loud, not Zach with his frantic attempts at damage control, not Mom with her hollow attempts at reconciliation, and not even me with my newfound distance, we all knew we had stepped into a version of reality none of us could comfortably live in anymore. By the third month after everything imploded, after the claims had been processed, after the unpaid bills were officially pinned on Zach's already fragile financial record, after my mother's shocked silence turned into strained acceptance that I was no longer going to play the martyr, life had returned, on the surface, to something resembling normalcy. I went to work, I paid my bills, I bought a new car, nothing flashy but something reliable, something mine, something that no one else had a key to. And yet, through it all, there was this persistent sense of dislocation, like I was still walking through the ashes of a fire that hadn't fully gone out. Zach had disappeared from my daily life entirely, which, in its own quiet way, was both a relief and a sadness I hadn't expected to feel so sharply. For years, even in his worst moments, he had been a constant presence, an exhausting, draining, maddening presence, but a presence nonetheless. And now that he had finally been forced to face the consequences of a life spent avoiding them, he had retreated, not with an apology or a reckoning, but with silence. Word got around that he had moved in with some friends 2 towns over, that he was picking up work here and there, trying to keep his head above water, telling anyone who would listen that his sister had screwed him over, that I was cold as ice, that I had ruined his life over a car. And maybe he believed that. Maybe it was easier to frame the story that way, to paint himself as the victim of my newfound boundary instead of the architect of his own collapse. Mom, to her credit, or maybe to her shame, tried in her own fumbling way to make amends, but the words never came. She would call occasionally, always with some mundane excuse, asking about the weather, my job, the holidays, but never once did she ask how I was actually doing. Never once did she reference the conversation in my kitchen or the folder of evidence I had laid before her, and I understood then that her guilt was too big to name. Because naming it would mean acknowledging all the years she had chosen not to see me, all the moments she had looked away from my sacrifices and smiled at Zach's recklessness, telling herself it was just easier that way. And so she tiptoed around me like I was made of glass, not realizing that I had already shattered a long time ago. And yet, despite the righteousness I felt in standing my ground, despite the satisfaction that came from watching the carefully constructed tower of denial begin to crumble around them, there was a part of me, small but persistent, that kept asking a question I hadn't been able to fully shake. Had I done the right thing, or had I just finally learned how to be cruel in a way that looked like justice? Because it's one thing to demand accountability, to say enough is enough, to stop letting yourself be bled dry by people who see your kindness as a resource to exploit. But it's another thing entirely to orchestrate a downfall, even if that downfall is deserved. It's a darker part of yourself you don't like to look at directly. The part that finds satisfaction not just in being free of someone, but in watching them fall without your help. I'd love to say that I found peace, that walking away from their chaos gave me some kind of closure, but the truth is far less clean. There were nights I sat up in bed, staring at the ceiling, remembering the way Zach used to follow me around as a kid, tugging at my sleeve, begging me to let him play with whatever I was doing. I remembered birthdays spent baking cakes alone in the kitchen, trying to make him feel special, trying to be the adult when the adults were too tired or too absent. I remembered the night Dad died, and the way he curled up on my bed and cried into my shirt like he was 6 years old again. Those moments, they didn't disappear just because I finally stood up for myself. They lingered, they complicated things. And maybe that's the hardest part, learning to live in the gray, in the space between being the victim and becoming someone else's villain. Because no matter how justified I felt, no matter how many receipts I had, I still felt the weight of what I'd done. I had turned my back on my brother. I had handed my mother a mirror she never wanted to look into. I had taken my pain and wrapped it in paperwork and silence and let it do the punishing for me. Then one day, I got a voicemail from Mom. It was short, quiet, and hesitant, her voice unsure in a way I hadn't heard since I was a child. She said she wanted to talk, not about Zach, not about the car, not even about the money. Just talk, just me and her. I stared at the phone for a long time. My thumb hovered over the play button, then moved to delete, then back again. And in the end, I pressed delete, not because I was angry, not because I wanted revenge, but because I knew whatever conversation she wanted now was about making herself feel better, not about making things right. That voicemail became a symbol for everything I had chosen to walk away from. The need to be needed, the desire to fix what was never mine to fix, the instinct to comfort people who never once offered me the same. And as I sat there, the apartment bathed in late afternoon light, the hum of traffic filtering through the window, I didn't feel powerful or victorious or even free. I felt quiet, like a chapter had ended. Not with a bang, but with a slow, deliberate turning of the page. Forgiveness, I realized, isn't something you owe anyone who refuses to change. And family, no matter how deeply embedded in your bones, doesn't get to be your burden just because they share your name. Sometimes, choosing yourself isn't selfish. Sometimes, it's the first honest thing you've done in years. And sometimes, the cleanest revenge is walking away and letting them sit in the mess they swore they'd never make, without you there to clean it up. Because in the end, justice and spite may look the same to the people who never knew the difference, but you'll know, and that's enough.